Welcome to episode 40 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring pestilence and death with two films that revolve around plague, satanism, religious intolerance, and necromancy. First up, we have The Masque of the Red Death from 1964 and director Roger Corman, starring Vincent Price, Hazel Court, Patrick Magee, and Jane Asher. Then we follow this with A Plague of a Different Colour and Black Death from 2010, directed by Christopher Smith. This stars Eddie Redmayne, Sean Bean, Andy Nyman, and Carice van Houten. Along the way, we'll be discussing the life and early career of director Roger Corman, the historical facts of the Black Death, the horror career of Andy Nyman, and much, much more. But before we do any of that, as always, I'd just like to mention the main sources that I've used when preparing this week's episode, all of which will be listed or linked in the show notes. So, when discussing director Roger Corman, I have heavily referenced his autobiography, the appropriately titled How I Made 100 Movies in Hollywood and Never Lost a Dime, and also the book Corman Poe, Interviews and Essays Exploring the Making of Roger Corman's Edgar Allan Poe films, and that was written by Chris Alexander. I've also referenced the book The Masque of the Red Death, written by Steve Haberman, that's published as part of the Devil's Advocate series of books, and the documentaries Master of Cinema, Roger Corman, Corman's World, and Roger Corman, the Pope of Pop Cinema, all of which can be found on YouTube. And when discussing 2010's Black Death, I have referenced interviews and extras that can be found on the special edition Blu-ray from Umbrella Entertainment, the press book that accompanied the film's release, an interview with writer Dario Poloni from the website medievalists.net, and interviews with Christopher Smith from the websites opium.org.pl, cinemawithoutborders.com, and filmmakermagazine.com. And as always, I have also referenced the IMDb and Wikipedia pages for the films and their cast and crew. Over a Hollywood career spanning 6 decades and upwards of 500 movies, director and producer Roger Corman acquired a host of unofficial titles, including the Pope of Pop Cinema, the King of Cult, and the Godfather of the New Hollywood. Although frequently associated with low-budget exploitation movies, he also launched the careers of Jack Nicholson, Robert De Niro, and Martin Scorsese, to name just a few. And his production and distribution company New World Pictures was also instrumental in introducing many European films to the American market, including works by Ingmar Bergman, Federico Fellini, Akira Kurosawa, and Francois Truffaut. Described by director James Cameron as the quintessential independent, and by actor Jack Nicholson as his quote-unquote lifeblood, the influence of his work and ethos on the art of filmmaking cannot be overstated. It would be impossible to cover every aspect of his career in just one episode, so I'm going to begin this week by talking about his early life and just some of the films for which he is best remembered, as well as a couple that aren't, but really should be. He was born in Detroit, Michigan in April 1926, a year before the arrival of his younger brother Gene, who would later join him in the film business. His father William was a civil engineer, and he instilled in his sons the importance of play and getting a good education, as opposed to taking part-time jobs like paper rounds, saying to them, "You'll have your whole life to work." Like many boys of his day, Corman spent his childhood reading Boy's Life magazine, adventure stories, and novels featuring the character Tom Swift, publications that he described in his autobiography as low-key propaganda, selling the American way of life. Born 3 years before the stock market crash of 1929, he said that while his father was able to work throughout the Great Depression, the worried discussions about money and the future may well have shaped his frugal attitude towards filmmaking, later going on to say that he was appalled by the waste and excess demonstrated by the major film studios. He once said to Jack Nicholson, If you don't understand money in the movie business, it's a bit like an artist who doesn't understand paint. Well, I understand paint, he continued, and if I've got to thin her up with turpentine to make the picture, then I thin her up. In the late 1930s, his family, having grown a little tired of the Michigan winters, moved to California, more specifically to South Altamont, Los Angeles. Moving from the Midwest to the West Coast came as something of a culture shock, and Roger soon found himself entering Beverly Hills High, surrounded by classmates with famous last names like Goldwyn and Warner. In Detroit, he said, there wasn't one really rich kid in school, but at Beverly Hills High he became immediately aware that some of the kids in his class came from incredibly wealthy families. It was here that he was introduced to the works of Edgar Allan Poe, specifically the story The Fall of the House of Usher. He studied this in English class and loved it so much that he asked his parents for a copy of Poe's complete works. He even briefly considered some form of literary career, working as the editor for the school magazine and taking radio speech classes and acting in school plays. But even then, his likely career trajectory would be to follow his father into engineering. And once he graduated in 1943, he continued his education at Stanford. As it was wartime, he volunteered for a Navy officer training program called the V-12, though it's quite clear that the discipline required didn't sit well with his more rebellious nature. He later said of the experience, quote, "Those were the worst 2 years of my life. I came very close to setting the record for the most demerits, because I felt if they set up a rule, well then I really must break it." End quote. True to form, when he later graduated in engineering, he worked for 4 days as an engineer and then quit, saying to his boss, "I've made a terrible mistake and I really have to quit. Today." And quit he did. By this time, he had realised that his true interests lie in filmmaking, and he was determined to break into the film industry. And this wasn't as a way of making money, but to exercise his growing creativity, an aspect that we can see in the earliest and even the cheapest of his movies. His first break came in 1948, when a friend of his father's got him a job as a messenger at Fox Studios. He did this for 6 months, biking messages, film cans, and letters across the studios 6 days a week. But looking for an opportunity, he asked the studio manager to let him work on Saturdays for nothing, so that he could be on set and soak up as much knowledge as he could, also occasionally working in the story department. The strategy paid off, and when an opportunity arose, he became a script analyst. But at 22, he was the youngest script reader, and was only given what he was called the most useless stories to cover. One day on set, he heard that the studio was looking for a western for their film star Gregory Peck, and he remembered a script that one of his friends had covered and had rejected. Retrieving the script, he said it was the first thing he read at Fox that he thought was any good, and he made a number of notes to make the story work. He submitted these to his story editor, who simply responded, "Thanks, good work. We might do something with this." Whatever notes Roger added must have been effective, as the screenplay became the 1950 movie The Gunfighter. This is a film that historians have said changed the Western genre, particularly with its more psychological approach to the characters and the material. But unfortunately, while the story editor got a bonus for Roger's notes, Corman received no recognition at all, even though, of course, it was his amendments that were used in the final movie. Incredibly disillusioned, he called the experience a valuable lesson in the way that the system worked, and decided to quit the studio. He used his Navy experience to claim college tuition and subsistence on the GI Bill, which provided veterans with the means to an education. With this, he headed to Oxford in England, not to gain a full degree, but to study modern English literature. "I knew I was going to be a writer, producer, or director of motion pictures," he said, "and I needed more background in the arts of the 20th century. I had a great time while it lasted, But after a while, it was time for a change of pace. He moved to Paris, where he lived on the left bank and fell in with a crowd of American students, visiting jazz clubs and discussing existentialism while writing treatments for motion pictures that never got made. After a year in Europe, running out of money and tired of the winter weather, he returned to the States, where he got a job first at a literary agency and then as a grip at KLAC TV. While he was here, he sold his first screenplay to Allied artists. And this was a story he had written with a friend called The House on the Sea, but which the studio retitled to Highway Dragnet. So he quit his day job and worked for nothing on the set, and was eventually credited as both writer and producer. But he was far from happy with the end result, calling his breakthrough film a major turkey and thinking that his career was over before it had even begun. But, as it turns out, he was wrong. Highway Dragnet, while very low budget and not exactly a smash hit, did quite well financially. He later said that this taught him the valuable lesson that in filmmaking there are very few great successes and, importantly, very few total failures. He also saw, he said in his autobiography, a fair amount of time wasting on the production, and this is an observation that reflects his Depression-era mindset and which would inform his next project. This was a movie called Monster from the Ocean Floor, inspired by an article in the LA Times about an electricity-powered one-man submarine that had only just been tested. Struck by the idea that this would make a fantastic centerpiece for a movie, he called up the company that developed the submarine, saying that he was an independent producer with an idea for a movie with lots of underwater sequences. And in a move that would be the envy of many a social media influencer today, he proposed that the company let him use the sub for free in return for, you guessed it, exposure and a credit on the film. Rather surprisingly, but then again, I guess this was Hollywood, the company agreed, and Corman decided that this was the opportunity to start making films himself. Looking for backers, he sold shares in the movie to friends and family, and also used the earnings from Highway Dragnet, plus a small amount of his own savings. But even then, he was still $2,000 short. At this stage, he met a young acting student called Barney Ordung, who had ambitions to become a director. The two agreed that if Ordung put up the remaining $2,000, he could direct for a profit share of the movie. And this was how Roger Corman moved into film production. With an eye on the money, Roger wanted to save as much as possible, and also wanted to avoid paying the crew overtime. So, with this in mind, he got up every day before sunrise, drove the equipment truck to Malibu himself, unpacked the truck, and then, at the end of the day's filming, stayed past dark, reloading the truck and driving home. He later said that he was probably the only grip, driver, and producer in town. Despite describing the making of the picture as being both quick and raggedy, the finished film was quite a successful venture and was sold to a distribution company for an advance of $60,000. This allowed Corman to immediately pay back the money that he had borrowed, cover his negative costs, and still leave him with enough profit to go in production on his next movie. This would be a fast-paced action movie about an innocent man on the run caught up in the world of illegal street racing, and he called it The Fast and the Furious. But while the name will sound all too familiar to fans of Vin Diesel and The Rock, Corman's film itself did not form the basis for the modern-day billion-dollar franchise. The modern series was instead based on a 1998 article about road racing which had been published in a magazine. But during production, the producers were not really that happy with all of the proposed titles. One day, seeing a documentary about Corman and his 1954 B-movie, producer Nilo Moritz decided that the title fit the film that he was making, so he licensed it from Corman for what would be the first in a seemingly never-ending franchise of movies. Much as with Monster from the Ocean Floor, Corman managed to get all of his props, in this case all of the cars, completely free. He did this by borrowing them from sports car dealerships, removing the windshields, racing them for the film, then replacing the windshields before returning them. Even then though, the budget was still a jump up from the $12,000 he had spent on his debut. It came in at $50,000, which would be approximately $500,000 today, and part of this was spent on hiring established actors, Dorothy Malone and John Ireland. Offered less than his usual fee, Ireland initially rejected the role, but much like Barney Ordung, he had ambitions to direct. Eventually, they struck a deal. John Ireland would work for Corman's proposed salary if he could also direct the movie, and naturally, Roger said yes. The Fast and the Furious became the focus of much interest from various studios, with distribution offers for the finished film made by Republic, Columbia, and allied artists. But by this stage, Roger had other ambitions. He didn't just want to recoup his costs and make a minor profit, he was looking for a long-term deal. The success of Monster from the Ocean Floor and the potential of The Fast and the Furious attracted a pair of producers called James H. Nicholson and Samuel Z. Arkoff. The two were setting up a new distribution company that was initially called American Releasing Corporation, but which would change its name to American International Pictures, or AIP. Rather than a single distribution offer, they were willing to give Roger a 3-picture deal, something which would mark the beginning of a long-term relationship. And beginning with The Fast and the Furious, AIP would eventually grow into one of the largest and most influential independent movie distributors in cinema history. Although financial necessity had meant that his first 2 productions were directed by other people, by this stage Roger wanted to direct himself, and moving forward would alternate between directing duties and production. After The Fast and the Furious, his second film for AIP was 1955's 5 Guns West, a Civil War-era western about 5 violent criminals sent on a mission for the Confederate Army. But before he began his directing debut, he and a friend decided to shoot an 8-minute short on a beach in California to give Roger some practice in what would be his new career. It's safe to say that this wasn't all that successful, and he recalled in his biography looking at the footage, saying it didn't look good, and deciding that they shouldn't bother trying to finish it. He said to his friend, "Let's just say we both learned something out of this, and let it go at that." This one incident then acted as his formal filmmaking education. He later said that, as he never went to film school, essentially all of his quote-unquote student work ended up being shown on the big screen. And while he freely admitted that some of it wasn't as good as it might have been, he was learning new skills all of the time. AIP came into being at a time when there was a cultural shift in American cinema, and this is something that we covered fairly extensively back in episode 14 when we discussed the rise of American independent film. The emergence of television and the new cultural phenomena of the teenager meant that the major studios were losing their old audiences, and they also really didn't understand the new and emerging youth culture. On the other hand, AIP played directly into this market, creating cheap, fast, and youth-orientated programming that would allow teenagers to escape from their parents every weekend and go to the movies. And in his dual role as director and producer, Corman provided the very content they were looking for, delivering multiple films every year, often with a shooting time of 7 to 10 days. AIP co-owner Samuel Z. Arkoff later said of their relationship, quote, "Jim and I had a relationship with Roger that we never had with anyone else. We shook hands when we made a deal and sometimes never had a contract until after the picture was finished. Roger always delivered his films and we always paid him promptly. We had several different kinds of deals with him, Sometimes he would direct for us for a fee plus participation. Sometimes he would direct and produce, and we would put up some of the backing for a piece of the profits. Or we would go to him with a project, a title, or just a poster, and Roger would come up with a story and direct it for a straight fee. The relationship was highly successful for all of us." End quote. For Corman, the beauty of the 1950s exploitation market was that films crossed multiple genres, including westerns, science fiction, juvenile delinquency movies, and of course horror. And so accordingly, across the 1950s, his films, either as director, producer, or sometimes both, crossed many different categories. These included It Conquered the World in 1956, and this features an alien monster that, in my opinion at least, looks like half a giant cucumber with some fangs and menacing eyes attached. There was also The Day the World Ended, a post-apocalyptic drama, also released in 1956, and 1957's Attack of the Crab Monsters. Also in 1957, he released the alien invasion thriller Not of This Earth, and the teen dramas Carnival Rock, Teenage Doll, and Sorority Girl. His self-created film school, with its fast turnarounds and tight budgets, meant that he quickly learned how to handle the camera and also learned about editing. But at this stage, he felt he needed to know more about acting, something that would lead him to enroll in acting classes in LA. It was here that he met a young would-be actor called Jack Nicholson, eventually casting him in his first motion picture, The Crybaby Killer, released in 1958. Nicholson later said that Corman was the only person who hired him for the first 10 years of his career, but also admitted that the end result was not always of the highest quality. Quote, "I've had terrible experiences going into the theatre with movies that I made in that period with Roger, because a lot of them were pretty grim. By mistake, he actually made a good picture every once in a while. I was never in it, but that's as much my fault as the next guy." End quote. In the same year, he also gave a first starring role to an actor called Charles Bronson in the movie Machine Gun Kelly, an action noir based on the life of the real-life gangster. Despite its low budget, it was very well received by US critics, but did even better in Europe. And Corman's work started to be discussed in film journals like Cahiers du Cinéma. In 1959, he directed The Wasp Woman, a science fiction horror about the aging owner of a beauty company who injects herself with an experimental serum to regain her lost youth. And this must surely be some kind of forerunner to The Substance. In the same year, he also released the horror comedy A Bucket of Blood. This is a parody of the beatnik art scene and features Dick Miller as a busboy who accidentally kills a cat and then covers it in plaster. The in-crowd then hail him as a genius, and he ends up having to commit multiple murders to produce new sculptures for his adoring audience. In 1960, Corman went one stage further, with the black and white horror comedy The Little Shop of Horrors, featuring a cannibalistic plant and Jack Nicholson as a masochistic dental patient. And this, of course, would become the basis for the multiple award-winning stage musical and its subsequent film adaptations. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, Roger began to have more confidence in his ability, and he approached AIP with a new idea. Invited to lunch by Jim Nicholson and Sam Arkoff, he proposed that instead of making two low-budget black and white movies for $100,000 each, they should give him twice the amount to direct a film in colour and shoot over 3 weeks instead of the usual 10 days. Though, to be honest, some of his earlier films were shot in far less than 10. "I'd like to do a classic," he told them, Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. Poe, he said, had a built-in audience. He was read in every high school, and his conclusion was that one quality film in colour would be better than two cheap films in black and white. After reassuring Arkoff and Nicholson that kids loved Poe and that there was indeed a built-in audience for the story, he was asked about the plot itself. "Where's the monster?" asked Arkoff, to which Corman replied, "The house is the monster." And it was this response that sold them on the idea. AIP gave him the go-ahead for a 15-day schedule and a production budget of around $270,000, though a third of that would be used to secure the talents of Vincent Price. In Vincent Price, Corman said in his autobiography, quote, "I found a man of cultural refinement for Usher. He was a fine actor and a handsome leading man who had a distinguished career. I felt that audiences had to fear the leading man, but not on a conscious and physical level based on strength. I wanted a man whose intelligent but tormented mind works beyond the minds of others, and who thus inspires a deeper fear." End quote. And this is certainly true of Price's performance as Prince Prospero in The Masque of the Red Death, playing a man so blinded by his own arrogance and cruelty that he thinks he can cheat death itself, and who ultimately, and very happily, has to pay the ultimate price, if you'll forgive the pun. With a screenplay by Richard Matheson, who we discussed at length in episode 8, House of Usher was a huge success, and would be the first of 7 Poe adaptations that Corman directed for AIP, with an 8th, The Haunted Palace, more accurately being based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Far removed from the gritty, cheap black and white of his early films, this series is shot in glorious colour and cinemascope, and has a visual look that is very much all its own. By this time, Roger had been studying psychoanalysis, an interest that would inform his Poe cycle, which he described as landscapes of the mind. For him, these stories took place in the unconscious, and as a result, should be largely filmed on studio-bound sets, with very little shown of the outside world. In his autobiography, he expanded on this further, saying, quote, "I was using what I knew of Freud's dream interpretations, and also my own analysis, to make the pictures work on an unconscious and symbolic plane as well. The deeper you go into the dark hallways then, the deeper you are delving into, say, an adolescent boy's first sexual stirrings. These are contradictory urges, an irresistible attraction and desire for sex, and a fear of the unknown and of the illicit. The very ambivalence builds tension." End quote. And we can certainly see this in The Masque of the Red Death, especially in the scene where Juliana, played by the British actress Hazel Court, first brands herself on the breast with an upside-down cross, and then later has a nightmarish dream sequence which is about as Freudian as you can possibly get. Despite their impressive look and greatly increased budget, Roger still found ways to make the films work financially, particularly in the art direction and the set design. For Usher, the art director Daniel Haller bought $2,000 worth of old scenery and props from Universal Studios, and also used access to set stock held by the major studios, something that Roger also went on to describe in his autobiography. Quote, "All studios gave you free access to their scene docs, and we put together some great, big-looking sets from columns, arches, windows and furniture from all over the place. Then we saved everything from each picture and stored it back in the scene doc. So, if anyone looks at the Poe films back to back, they'll see some sets and specific units reappearing. If we had the same art department budget for the second picture, we had, say, $20,000 worth of sets stored from the first, so it became a $40,000 design. For the third set, we had, say, $40,000 worth of stock, and spent another $20,000 on new design. It wasn't quite that mathematical, but it explains how the Poe films look increasingly more elaborate without stretching the production budget or the shooting schedule." End quote. Following the success of Usher, particularly in Europe, AIP of course wanted more. Although some thought was given to making an adaptation of The Masque of the Red Death, the second film in the series would be The Pit and the Pendulum, released in 1961. This was once again scripted by Richard Matheson and starred Vincent Price, alongside co-star Barbara Steele, and was even more successful than House of Usher. Director Jonathan Demme later recalled the impact that the Poe movies had on him as a young man. "We never missed a Poe movie," he said. "They were riveting and stylish and hip and funny. We couldn't wait until the next one, and of course with Roger you didn't have to wait very long. The next one is gonna come out like a month later." But at the same time, Corman was looking to work on a more personal project, one that reflected his deeply felt political and social convictions, and that would move him away from the world of exploitation and into more socially committed filmmaking. In 1958, the writer Charles Beaumont had published a novel called The Intruder. This story, as Corman himself says, quote, was based on an actual incident in which a northern bigot went into a Tennessee town and created a semi-fascist party, inflaming the populace so intensely that the National Guard had to come in. End quote. This was the story that Roger wanted to tell, something that reflected his belief in the civil rights movement and, in particular, his support of the integration of the American education system. It was certainly controversial subject matter, especially in 1961, and it proved a very difficult project to get off the ground. AIP declined to produce it, something that Roger said he found surprising because they normally said yes to everything. Allied artists also thought it was too controversial, so Roger decided to produce it completely himself, as a project for his own company called the Film Group. Film developers Pathé Lab, who wanted to get into film production, also provided some of the money, and the rest came from his younger brother, Gene. Gene later said, quote, "This was not and is not an exploitation film. It was the first film that Roger made where he could actually make a statement about his personal feelings, as opposed to doing the Poe films, or the films that were just exploitation drive-in movies." End quote. For the lead role, they hired an unknown stage actor called William Shatner. Here, Shatner is making his movie debut, playing a white supremacist who arrives from Washington and who insinuates himself into small-town life, making bigoted speeches and inciting acts of violence against the town's black and liberal communities. An indictment of the racism that gripped America at the time, Roger decided that the story should be shot entirely on location, in a town called Sixton in Missouri. He also made the decision that only 3 of the actors would be brought in from Hollywood, and the other actors would be local to the area, even deciding to use the local community as extras for the crowd and background scenes. This was a controversial decision, and it would feed into a controversial shoot. At first, the locals, who knew Roger's name from his horror pictures, assumed that it would be another genre movie. But when the reality of the narrative was discovered, there was a great deal of opposition. The production team were threatened by the sheriff, called communists by the locals, were sent death threats, and almost run out of town. William Shatner later recalled the tension, saying, quote, "We were surrounded by some very emotional people down there. Our lives were threatened. The only integration in the area seemed to be a gang of ex-convicts who had formed what the police called a wolf pack. They were the wolves of society, and they said they would kill us in our motel." End quote. But despite the threats of violence, the film was completed and was a critical success, with the New York Herald Tribune calling it a major credit to the entire motion picture industry. It won a prize at the Venice Film Festival and was also meant to be shown at Cannes, but was later withdrawn, potentially due to its controversial content. Unfortunately though, movie audiences stayed away, and those that went nearly rioted. At one screening, accusations of communist were screamed at the screen, and Gene Corman was pinned against the wall by a cinema usher. Gene later said that it was the only film on which he and Roger never made money, despite it being the best movie they ever made. Its commercial failure was the greatest disappointment in Roger Corman's career. The Intruder is currently available to watch on YouTube, and it's a very powerful and also very upsetting piece of filmmaking. It also features a surprisingly good performance from William Shatner as the chief antagonist. But if you are going to watch it, I'd just like to give you a warning. It is a true reflection of both racial tension and racism of the time, including in its use of language, which is incredibly shocking for a modern audience, or indeed any audience at all for that matter. As a result, it is a genuinely frustrating, annoying and upsetting watch, so please don't say I didn't warn you. Sad to say, it is also horribly reminiscent of scenes that we still see today on social media and on the news. Ultimately, the commercial failure of The Intruder steered Corman away from his dream of making socially committed films, though he did later say that it taught him a valuable lesson. Quote, "I thought I should go back to a more commercial type of film. I was starting to learn method acting technique. It was what was known as the text and the subtext. The text is the written script, what you are saying. The subtext is what you mean, what you really feel that causes you to say these words. And I felt I should make my subject matter the text, which would be a commercial text, but my theme, my message, what is important to me, should be the subtext, so the audience would get what they paid their money to see." End quote. And so he continued with more exploitation movies and also continued the Poe series. He followed The Pit and the Pendulum with 1962's The Premature Burial, scripted by Charles Beaumont and the only film in the series to not star Vincent Price. It instead featured actor Ray Milland in the lead role, and Milland would go on to star in another Corman film a year later, the non-Edgar Allan Poe related X, the Man with X-Ray Eyes. The next Poe movie was the anthology Tales of Terror in 1962, and this was followed by the horror comedy The Raven in 1963, which starred horror legends Vincent Price, Boris Karloff and Peter Lorre. This also featured Jack Nicholson, who later recalled that Corman's only direction to him was to try to be as funny as the three leads. The Haunted Palace came next, again in 1963, and then in 1964 he directed the seventh film in the series and the first of this week's movies, The Masque of the Red Death. All of which then brings us on to The Masque of the Red Death, which was of course directed by Roger Corman. It stars Vincent Price, Hazel Court, Jane Asher and Patrick Magee, and was based on a screenplay by Charles Beaumont, the author of The Intruder. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so as always, if you haven't seen the film, it's time to press pause and come back once you have. Poe's original story concerns Prince Prospero, a rather obnoxious character who is described as happy and dauntless and sagacious. Prospero, accompanied by a group of other so-called nobles, seals himself in his castellated abbey to avoid the Red Death, a terrible plague that is sweeping the country. The key symptoms of the plague, which come on very quickly, are indeed rather terrible. Sharp pains, sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, leading to death within half an hour. Locked safely within the abbey walls, the group intend to sit out the plague in luxury and decadence, and have little interest or concern regarding the death and suffering that is happening outside. One night, the prince decides to hold a masquerade ball as entertainment. In the text, Poe describes this as, quote, "much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust." End quote. After much partying, the group notice a strange figure moving among them, tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the clothing of the grave. Even worse than the costume, which includes a mask described as resembling the face of a corpse, the figure is also splattered with blood, which is, of course, a key symptom of the plague that is decimating the countryside. The prince is outraged and insists that the figure be restrained and then hanged in the morning, but no one, apart from Prospero himself, will approach him. After pursuing the figure through a series of multicolored rooms, the prince suddenly collapses dead on the floor, and the rest of the revelers suddenly realize exactly who their mysterious figure is. Quote, "And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night. And one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bejeweled halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held an illimitable dominion over all." End quote. An extremely influential story, this Gothic tale has inspired many. There was the recent Netflix adaptation of several of Poe's stories, The Fall of the House of Usher. In this, Mike Flanagan swaps the castellated abbey for a nightclub, and the Red Death itself for a rain of acid gushing from the sprinklers onto the revelers below. But long before this, the Red Death found its way into popular culture. In the novel The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux, the Phantom disguises himself as the Red Death to attend a masquerade ball. And this is a moment that was brilliantly recreated by Lon Chaney in the 1925 silent classic version, and also briefly homaged in Tim Burton's 1992 movie Batman Returns. Jack London's novella, The Scarlet Plague, features a disease known as the Red Death that wipes out half of humanity. And the story has been quoted or referenced by Stephen King, Tom Wolfe, Chuck Palahniuk, and Dan Simmons, to name just a few. The Masque of the Red Death was first published in May 1842, and in his book of the same name, writer Steve Haberman suggests several sources and events that may have served as the writer's inspiration. The most significant of these was the tragic deterioration of his young wife Virginia due to the illness tuberculosis. In January of 1842, 2 months before Poe began writing his story, Virginia suffered a hemorrhage in her throat and blood began gushing out of her mouth. She lived as an invalid for 5 more years, suffering several more such attacks before dying on the 30th of January, 1847. Haberman also suggests that an 1832 cholera epidemic in Paris also fed into the narrative, and these were events that were documented by a writer called N.P. Willis, a man with whom Poe would have been very familiar. During the epidemic, many people decided to make the best of what little time they had left and began attending wild parties. Willis describes one of these as follows, quote, "At a masked ball, there were some 2,000 people in fancy dress, and one man, immensely tall, dressed as a personification of the cholera itself, with skeleton armor, bloodshot eyes, and other horrible appearances of a walking pestilence." End quote. The third influence that Haberman suggests is a story by Thomas Campbell called The Life of Petrarch, which Poe himself reviewed for an 1841 issue of Graham's magazine. In this story, a nobleman seals himself into his castle to escape the plague, but someone or something also manages to slip in unnoticed, and the nobleman escapes to the forest, where he later dies. The Masque of the Red Death is a story that Corman initially considered adapting as the second in his Poe cycle of films, but he decided against it. He felt that there were too many similarities in the story to Ingmar Bergman's movie The Seventh Seal, which had been released in 1957, and he was worried about comparisons. So this is why the second movie was The Pit and the Pendulum instead. But this didn't stop him from recruiting a new and inexperienced writer called John Carter to try his hand at an adaptation. Carter submitted the first draft in 1961, shortly after Corman completed filming on The Intruder. At 150 pages long, the script was far too long for a Roger Corman movie, or indeed many movies of the time, and so Corman gave the screenplay to writer Charles Beaumont for a second opinion. Beaumont was highly critical, calling it dull, undramatic, uninteresting, and pointless. So, I guess Charles didn't like it very much. Beaumont was already busy finishing the screenplay for The Premature Burial and also the screenplay for The Haunted Palace, and so Corman sent notes to Carter for a major rewrite. Sadly for Carter, the second draft still did not meet Corman's expectations, and ultimately he would be removed from the project. With Beaumont still busy, Corman then approached Robert Towne, who would later go on to write 1974's Chinatown. But the writer took far too long with the project for Corman's fast turnaround time, and so eventually the job went back to Charles Beaumont to complete once he had finished all of his other screenplays. Beaumont's finished screenplay was 115 pages long and forms the basis for what we now see on screen, albeit some later changes were made. Happier with this version, but still not entirely satisfied, Corman then gave the new draft to another writer, R. Wright Campbell. Campbell suggested adding in another post-story to help liven up the second half of the movie, which both he and Corman felt was a little bit too static. The second story was Hop Frog, which was published by Poe in 1849. In this story, a man with dwarfism works as a jester in the court of a particularly obnoxious king, who is surrounded by 7 equally obnoxious ministers. At the court is another person with dwarfism, a female dancer called Trippetta, and she and Hop Frog become close friends, bound together by the terrible circumstances within the king's court. One day, for his own cruel entertainment, the king forces Hop Frog, a name they have given him as he is partially crippled, to drink excessive amounts of wine. When Trippetta implores the king to spare her friend, the monarch strikes her and then throws a goblet of wine in her face. Furious, Hop Frog plots a terrible revenge. The king is planning a masquerade ball and asks the jester for ideas for costumes. Hop Frog suggests that the king and his ministers all dress as orangutans, a stunt that he says will frighten all of the ladies of the court and will be a sensation. He also suggests that for added realism, they should be bound together by chains, and then sets about helping to prepare their costumes. Quote, "The king and his ministers were first encaged in tight-fitting stocking shirts and drawers. They were then saturated with tar. At this point of the process, someone of the party suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8 that the hair of such a brute as the orangutan was more efficiently represented by flax. A thick coating of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coating of the tar." End quote. Now, of course, highly flammable, the party enter the masquerade and are indeed a sensation. Hop Frog, using the chains that he has so casually suggested, strings them up to a chandelier and then sets them on fire, escaping with Trippetta into the darkness. But this is not before he has some final words for the now flaming king and his company. Quote, "I see now distinctly," he said, "what manner of people these maskers are. They are a great king and his 7 privy councillors. a king who does not scruple to strike a defenceless girl, and his 7 counsellors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hopfrog the Jester. And this is my last jest." End quote. Corman immediately saw that this story fitted neatly into the court of Prince Prospero, and the addition was made. But the most controversial aspect of the movie was not from the pen of either Charles Beaumont or Campbell, but from Roger Corman himself. In Beaumont's original screenplay, Prince Prospero is simply a rich and heartless bastard, but Corman wanted to take this a step further and make him a Satanist. And this was a theme that was highly controversial at the time, as we discussed in depth back in episode 6. It was an audacious move, and one that resulted in the film being heavily cut by the censors, as well as incurring the wrath of the Catholic League of Decency, who condemned the film as morally objectionable on its release in the United States. But for Corman, this change was about more than just adding shock value. It spoke to the prince's character and the subtext that he wanted to include in the film. This subtext was an exploration of religion, something that he had barely touched upon in his earlier movies. In an interview with writer Chris Alexander for the book Corman Poe, he explained this further. Quote, "I would actually say that I'm agnostic, though yes, I am very much interested in all religions and was happy to explore some of those questions here. A lot of the dialogue in The Masque of the Red Death was deliberately put in by me, and the way that I wanted to interpret it had a quasi-religious feeling. I see it more as Prospero using Satan to actively reject God, and thereby reject natural law. By convincing himself that God doesn't exist, or that he's above God, he gives himself a free rein to do as he pleases." End quote. The final version of the screenplay keeps the basis of Poe's story intact, but expands it with additional characters and a not insignificant amount of subtext. The film tells the story of Prince Prospero, played by Vincent Price, a Satanist who terrorizes and patronizes the local communities, treating them with both savagery and contempt. One day, visiting a nearby village, he is enraged by signs of rebellion from 2 of its inhabitants, a young man named Gino, who is played by David Weston, and an older man named Ludovico, who is played by Nigel Green. About to put them to death, he is begged for clemency by a beautiful young girl named Francesca. Ludovico, as it turns out, is her father, while Gino is the man that she loves. Just as the prince is about to make Francesca choose which of the 2 should be killed, he is alerted to the fact that the village is infected by the Red Death. He has it burnt to the ground and takes Francesca, Ludovico, and Gino as his captives. On returning to the castle, the 2 men are held in the dungeons, while Francesca, who is pure, innocent, and a Christian, becomes a captive of the castle, a new toy that Prospero aims to corrupt. She is introduced to court life and the sycophantic depravities of Prospero's house guests, who crawl around on the floor like animals just to stay in his good graces. And all of this, of course, is while the Red Death lays waste to the rest of the country. Prospero's lover, Juliana, who is also a Satanist, is understandably not that happy with Francesca's presence, particularly when she is told to dress the girl in her own finest clothing. She tells Francesca that she will do little to help her, to which the younger girl responds, "You will do as he tells you, and I will do what I must do to save my men." Francesca, then, is smarter and tougher than she first appears, and it is largely through her eyes that we see the realities of Prospero's castle. She is played by Jane Asher, who Corman cast for her acting ability and a quality of innocence that he said made her perfect for the role. For her part, Asher, who was 17 at the time of filming, was a fan of both horror and Vincent Price, as well as being a lover of Edgar Allan Poe, so she grabbed the opportunity with both hands. She later said that, as a confirmed atheist, being the incarnation of Christian goodness wasn't something that came naturally, and that she was basically playing against type. She also had very positive memories of working with Corman, who she says helped shape her performance with kindness, humour and encouragement, going on to say that this was not always the way that directors would use their powers, especially with a 17-year-old girl. She also said that Vincent Price was funny, kind and a fatherly figure who approached every day with a sense of fun and delivered his lines with both ease and enjoyment. One thing, though, that she did not enjoy was the bath scene when Francesca first arrives at Prospero's court, saying in a later interview with The Guardian, quote, "They stuck some awful little modesty circles onto my nipples and they kept floating off in the water. I'd reach for them wildly and try to stick them back on. It drove the camera operator crazy as he had to keep cutting the shot. I could sense his impatience with this silly girl, which made me all the more anxious." End quote. This, though, was tempered by the general atmosphere and the elegance of both her costumes and the set design. In the same interview, she said, quote, "I remember walking through the beautiful coloured rooms in my wonderful medieval dress and elaborate hairstyle and loving every minute of it." End quote. The set designs are indeed stunning, particularly the suite of coloured rooms that we first see as Prospero guides Francesca through the palace. These were based on a description of the rooms in Poe's original story, and the shots of Price and Asher wandering through rooms of yellow, white and purple is truly something to behold. This was photographed by cinematographer Nicholas Roeg, and is echoed in the later sequence of Juliana wandering through the rooms in the opposite direction, following her marriage to Satan. The beauty of the film was achieved in no small part by the decision to shoot in England, allowing the production to benefit from the ED levy tax subsidy that we have now discussed quite a few times. Now a co-production between AIP and UK company Anglo Amalgamated, the budget on the film was increased to $400,000, which would be the equivalent of $4 million today. And even in England, Corman had access to the set stocks held in storage at Elstree Studios. This allowed he and regular art director Daniel Haller to raid the sets of the multi-million-pound production Beckett, which had starred Richard Burton, Peter O'Toole, and, in a minor role, David Weston, who plays Gino. So it's no wonder then that Prospero's castle looks as good as it does. But working with a British cast and crew proved a rather different experience for the director, who was rather perturbed by the need to stop for 11s in the morning, followed by lunch, and then a tea break in the afternoon at 3 p.m. The experience, however, did allow him to meet some British royalty, of the pop kind as opposed to the real thing, which, on reflection, was probably preferable. One day, Jane Asher brought her then boyfriend along to the set, an incident that Corman recounted to writer Chris Alexander. Quote, "She and I used to have lunch together, and one day she introduced me to a friend of hers from Liverpool called Paul. I asked what he did, and he said he was in a singing group and that they were making their debut in London that night. I wished them well. It was, of course, Paul McCartney, and the next day the headline in the paper read Beatles Conquer London. They were already the biggest group in England, but I had no idea who they were." End quote. Once Francesca has arrived at court, we meet the other occupants, all sheltering from the Red Death under Prospero's supposed protection. These include, of course, the Lady Juliana, but we also meet the truly repellent Alfredo, played by the great Patrick Magee. Magee should be a familiar face to fans of 1970s and 80s horror. He stars in the 1972 Amicus anthology movie Tales from the Crypt as a vengeful blind man, and also as the main antagonist in Lucio Fulci's 1981 version of Poe's The Black Cat. Perhaps, though, he is best remembered for his role as Mr. Alexander in 1971's A Clockwork Orange, and also for his multiple stage appearances in plays by Samuel Beckett and Harold Pinter. In 1968, he appeared in a film version of Pinter's most famous play, The Birthday Party, and this was directed by William Friedkin and co-starred Robert Shaw. It's quite a fantastic adaptation and highly enjoyable, and if you want to watch it, it's available on YouTube. Magee had worked with Corman before this movie, appearing in The Young Racers in 1963. In the same year, Roger gave fledgling director Francis Ford Coppola the opportunity to direct his first feature, a low-budget black-and-white shocker called Dementia 13, which was filmed in Ireland and used many of the same crew as The Young Racers, including, again, Magee. Of his performance in Masque of the Red Death, Corman said that Magee could find strange little quirks in his character, making it a richer and more fully rounded characterization. He also said that he thought that Magee brought a real sense of menace and the macabre to his performance. And this he most certainly does, especially in the scene where he first sees the dancer Esmeralda, watching her with a lascivious gaze that is deeply uncomfortable to watch. And this is all the more so because one cannot help but be reminded of certain figures that we are hearing about in the news at the moment. Alfredo is a truly malignant and depraved force of evil, and when he gets his just desserts in the hop frog section of the movie, one cannot help but feel extremely satisfied. It's just a shame that the same thing couldn't have happened to his real-life counterpart, but there's never a vengeful court jester around when you need one. Esmeralda, whose name has been changed from the Trippetta of the Poe story, is played rather disconcertingly by a very young girl called Verena Greenlaw, who was then overdubbed with an adult voice. This decision was not Corman's first choice. They had originally sought an actress with dwarfism to play the role, opposite the adult actor Skip Martin, who plays her friend and vengeful saviour, and whose name here has been changed to Hop Toad. According to Corman, they had auditioned many female performers, but none were quite right for the part. So instead, they decided to find a young girl dancer and use makeup and costume to age up the role, looping her dialogue with an adult voice to make it work. Although he freely admitted this was not quite as effective as it should have been, I have to say it makes Alfredo's intentions towards her all the more disturbing. So while I would agree with Corman in the most part, I have to say it does add an even more unsettling subtext, particularly reviewed through the lens of 2026. The decision to turn Prospero into a fully blown Satanist adds to the overwhelming sense of corruption that permeates the movie, but it also allows for multiple exchanges about the nature of God and religion, and this for me gives the film an extra depth that is somewhat missing from the earlier Poe productions. Perhaps this is more to do with the lessons that Corman learned from the failure of The Intruder, and his decision to hide more subtext beneath the surface of his films. The subtext then is demonstrated through numerous conversations between Prospero and Francesca. These include the quite marvellously pithy line, quote, "If you believe, my dear Francesca, you are gullible. Can you look around this world and believe in the goodness of a God who rules it? Famine, pestilence, war, disease, and death, they rule this world." End quote. When Francesca responds that no, there is also love and life and hope, she is told, quote, "Very little hope, I assure you. No, if a God of love and life ever did exist, he is long since dead. Someone, something, rules in his place." End quote. So it's no wonder that the Catholic League of Decency were rather appalled. And if that line didn't get them, one delivered by the Red Death himself probably did. Quote, "Each man makes his own God, his own heaven, and his own hell." End quote. The Satanism subplot also allows for the transformation of the character of Juliana, who in Beaumont's original story was simply Prospero's lover, and here is now a fellow Satanist. Corman, though, has been quick to point out that it is Juliana's desperate love for Prospero, despite his evil, that leads her down this path. She is played by Hazel Court, an enigmatic screen presence who had already appeared in Hammer's The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957 and The Man Who Could Cheat Death in 1959. After starring in the, in my opinion, rather poor 1961 British horror Dr. Blood's Coffin, she relocated to the States, where she starred in Corman's earlier Poe movies, The Premature Burial and The Raven, as well as several episodes of the series Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Once called the best screamer in the business, Court is an incredible presence here, from her silent jealousy of her young rival to the scenes of satanic marriage that in some countries sadly ended up on the sharp edge of the censor's scissors. This hallucinatory dream sequence is just one of many that Corman included in his Poe series, saying that they gave him an opportunity to really experiment with film. Quote, "I love shooting the dream sequences, as did the cast and crew. One idea I had was to dispense with everything other than the purely visual, so they were all shot silent and in black and white. I thought of them as exercises in cinema technique, where we could depart from reality by using special lenses, surreal sets, gels, and afterwards a lot of optical printing. From a theoretical standpoint, they were pure cinema." End quote. Interviewed by writer Terry Curtis Fox, Hazel Court later recalled that she had a highly enjoyable time working on the movie, though sometimes there was a little bit too much fun for Roger Corman. "At the end of The Masque of the Red Death," she said, "I think we were a little bit too much for him. And he said, I'm going back to UCLA to take a course in how to handle actors and make them behave." She also said that in hindsight, Juliana was such a devilish character that she was surprised they got away with it, censor or no censor. And she also recounted filming the most shocking moment in the movie. This is where she is attacked by Price's falcon after her satanic marriage, and was achieved through fake blood being painted onto the trained bird, which would then drip onto her for the sequence. I think it's safe to say that this, her dream sequence, and the already mentioned walk through the multicoloured rooms before she is killed are some of the highlights of the movie, and I say that with no offence meant to the rest of the cast. Corman has said that many of his films, particularly the Poe cycle, are about the inevitability of death, and also how one makes sense of the world. And for me, The Masque of the Red Death is the apotheosis of this. There are multiple deaths in the satanic dream sequence. There is also the shooting of Prospero's friend who begs for shelter. There is the massacre of the villagers who arrive at the castle to do the same. And then, of course, there is Juliana's death by falcon, which is capped by Price saying sarcastically, "Do not mourn Juliana. She has just married a friend of mine." There is also, of course, the arrival of the Red Death itself, and the unmasking to reveal Prospero's own face, a moment which suggests that death exists within us all. But perhaps the most perfect example of this theme comes from Price recounting the nature of terror, accompanied by the slow ticking of the enormous clock that dominates the Great Hall. "What is terror?" he asks. "Listen. Is it to awaken and hear the passage of time? Or is it the failing beat of your own heart? Or the footsteps of someone who, just a moment before, was in your room. And this sentiment is echoed in later dialogue from Price, again accompanied by the giant ticking clock just before Juliana's death. Hush, listen, the passing of time, the beating of a heart, the footsteps of an assassin, destiny. But perhaps the final word on the subject, and on the multiple themes explored in the film, belongs to Death himself, or should that be Death themselves. At the very end of the movie, we meet the Red Death once again, sitting on a mist-covered moor, but now joined by several other deaths, all in various coloured robes. Each recounts the numbers killed as they have travelled the world. The Yellow Death complains about the eternity of wandering, and that he is very tired. His colleague, the White Death, suggests that the weariness of those to whom they bring rest must be burdening him. And then the Red Death, standing and leading his colleagues into the night, delivers the final line of the movie in Latin, Sic transit gloria mundi, which translates to, thus passes the glory of the world. On its release in 1964, the film was not as successful as the other Poe pictures, and this is something that producer Samuel Z. Arkoff attributed to it being quote-unquote too arty-farty and not scary enough. Corman, with his usual pragmatic and very honest delivery, agreed, saying, quote, "I think that is a legitimate statement, and the fault may have been mine. I was becoming more interested in the Poe films as expressions of the unconscious rather than as pure horror films." End quote. To be fair, both probably have a point. But while the film is possibly not the best horror film of the Poe cycle, for me it is the best film of the series. And while admittedly the climactic interpretive dance sequence might go on for a bit too long, the rest of the movie for me is an absolute feast for the senses. There are also some wonderful performances from Vincent Price, Patrick Magee and Jane Asher, and especially, in my opinion, Hazel Court. Perhaps Andrew Johnston, writing in Time Out New York, said it best, quote, "Elaborate sets and costumes, and Nicholas Roeg's lush Technicolor photography make this as close as Corman ever came to real greatness." End quote. In 1965, Roger Corman temporarily moved away from independent pictures to make films with some of the major studios. He later said of this, quote, "For 10 years as an independent, I could get financing for $100,000 to $300,000 pictures. Everything has been interesting, artistically satisfying, and economically satisfying. But I decided I was going nowhere and wanted to move directly into the business, so I accepted a contract with Columbia." End quote. However, this did not turn out to be that successful a move, as many of the projects to which he became attached did not come to fruition. He later said of this that every idea he submitted was considered too strange and too weird, while every idea the studio had seemed far too ordinary, going on to say, quote, "Ordinary pictures don't make money." End quote. And that's something quite a few of the major studios could do with remembering these days. He returned to independent films for the remainder of the decade, including the biker movie The Wild Angels in 1966, and this was a film which kicked off the biker movie trend of the late 1960s. He also directed the psychedelic LSD drama The Trip for AIP in 1967. He also financed the brilliant Peter Bogdanovich movie Targets in 1968, which starred Boris Karloff, and also produced the H.P. Lovecraft adaptation The Dunwich Horror in 1970. Also in 1970, he directed the gangster film Bloody Mama, starring Shelley Winters and a very young Robert De Niro. And he also established his own production and distribution company, New World Pictures. New World would go on to produce far too many films to mention, But these included Caged Heat, the 1974 debut feature from director Jonathan Demme. A few years earlier, in 1972, Corman also produced a film called Boxcar Bertha, the second feature directed by Martin Scorsese. Of Corman, Scorsese once said, quote, "Roger is, despite himself, the most remarkable type of artist, because, while not taking himself too seriously, he was able to inspire and nurture other talent in a way that was neither envious nor difficult, but always generous." End quote. For the rest of his career, Roger Corman produced and directed a further 400 or so pictures, so I'm not going to discuss many more of them here, as we would quite literally be here for hours, but we will be covering a few more over the rest of the series. His final film as a director was Frankenstein Unbound, released in 1990, and his final producer credit was on Roger Corman's Death Race 2050, released in 2017. A maverick, a true talent, and a far better filmmaker than the title, The King of the B-Movies, would lead you to expect. He nurtured the careers of many and also made some incredible films. He died on the 9th of May 2024 at home in Santa Monica, California. He was 98 years old. And now we move away from dreamlike explorations of the unconscious, religion, and the unavoidability of death to a drama steeped in historical accuracy that delves into religious persecution, fundamentalism, and the exploitation of faith. This is our second movie of the week, Black Death from 2010, which stars Eddie Redmayne, Sean Bean, Carice Van Houten, Tim McInerney, and Andy Nyman, and was directed by Christopher Smith. We spoke about Christopher Smith back in episode 11, when we discussed his reality-bending horror Triangle from 2009. This then was his immediate follow-up, and with the director's insistence on grounding the horrors in historical accuracy, it's about as far away from that film as it's possible to get. And we're getting into the spoilers with this one straight away, so all usual warnings apply. Smith has described Black Death as part historical drama, part folk horror, and part western, with a touch of Apocalypse Now thrown in for good measure. Our chief protagonist is Osmond, a young monk living in 14th century England, a time when Europe was being laid waste by the titular disease, the bubonic plague. One of the most fatal pandemics in human history, it had far-reaching economic, cultural, and societal impacts, claiming as much as half of the European population over just 7 years. The origins of the disease are much disputed, with the bacterium Yersinia pestis evolving as early as the Neolithic period. Evidence suggests that this particular outbreak, which would not be the last, originated in China in the mid-1300s, and then was spread along trade routes westward toward the Mediterranean and northern Africa. The disease, spread from rats to humans by the bite of infected fleas, reached southern England in 1348, and northern Britain and Scandinavia by 1350. The rate of mortality from the disease varied from place to place. Towns where the danger of contagion was greater were the most badly hit, and within the towns, monastic communities provided the highest number of victims, most likely due to their communal living and their dedicated care for the sick. The ongoing consequences of the disease were as equally devastating as the number of initial deaths. The passing of so many working people meant that land could not be cultivated, leaving crops to rot in the fields and compounding the effects of the Great Famine that had impacted Europe just a few decades earlier. Anti-Semitism greatly intensified across Europe as people blamed the spread of the plague on Jewish communities, with entire communities killed by mobs or burned at the stake en masse. There was also a belief that the plague had been sent by God as a punishment for sin, and this is something that is fundamental to Smith's movie. Screenwriter Dario Poloni has called the period a writer's dream, in that it was a chaotic, turbulent, and unpredictable world. He went on to say, though, that he thought it was very hard to, quote, draw too much of a parallel between today's epidemics and what happened back in 1348, partly because the world was so different then, as was the mindset of the average person, end quote. This was from an interview given at the time of the film's release, 16 years ago. While I might well have agreed with him at the time, these days I find myself drawing some very uncomfortable parallels to the film, which sadly only goes to show how far we have regressed, though more on that a bit later. He went on to say, quote, I believe that fear of contagious disease is part of the human psyche, and of course this made the period especially interesting. But just as much of an attraction was the Wild West aspect, the lawlessness, the fear of the unknown, and the lack of central organisation. End quote. The film opens with Osmond, the young monk played by Eddie Redmayne, who we discover is in love with both God and also a young girl called Averil, with whom he grew up. Torn between the two, he helps Averil to leave the confines of the monastery, telling her that he too will leave and join her later. That night he prays to God for a sign, something that will show him that he can love God in another way rather than through celibacy and the life of the monastery. As if in answer to his prayers, or certainly that's how Osmond sees it, the next day 2 horsemen arrive at the monastery. One is Ulrich, an envoy for the bishop and a warrior for God, and the other is Swire, a mercenary who joined Ulrich's mission primarily for financial reasons. Ulrich tells the abbot, who is played in a brief cameo by the great David Warner, of a remote community that has been untouched by the plague. As the plague is believed to have been sent by God, a town that is without it is possibly a town that is without God, and there are even rumours of necromancy being practiced. The men have come to the monastery looking for a guide, and Osmond, believing this to be the sign for which he prayed, volunteers for the job. As he leaves the monastery, the abbot warns him that the mission will change him. As it turns out, that warning is far more accurate than the abbot could even imagine. Osmond, Ulrich, and Swire ride off to join the rest of Ulrich's group, a crew of soldiers, including an in-house torturer. Their mission is to capture the supposed necromancer and bring them back to the bishop, and for this purpose, they have a rather brutal-looking Iron Maiden strapped to a wagon. As Ulrich himself describes it, they are embarking on a journey into hell. But fortunately for them, he adds, they have a holy man to guide them on their way. One of the reasons that I like this film, which after Triangle is my favourite of Smith's movies, is the ambiguity of its characters, and, Osmond aside, the overall lack of good guys to root for. The soldiers that we accompany on their journey are far from the archetypal protagonists of traditional folk horror. They are violent and aggressive, and their mission, to capture and torture a suspected necromancer, is a far cry from the nature of Sergeant Howie's mission in 1973's The Wicker Man, a film with which there are admittedly quite a few parallels. In that film, Sergeant Howie is a man of God, but he is searching to find and save a missing child, while here the journey is driven by a much darker belief system, a narrative that Smith has described as a journey into fundamentalism. He said of this in an interview at the time of the film's release, quote, "Obviously, I was aware when making the film that it deals with religion, but some religions are an easier target or a clumsier target than others. If you were going to make a film that derided religion, perhaps paganism or Christianity would be easy targets. I didn't want to do that. It's not about whose God is better than who else's God. It's about the way people's religions get distorted by people who are seeking power." End quote. From here, the movie shifts into Heart of Darkness territory, with the journey to the mythical village becoming increasingly more violent and surreal. This includes the moment that they meet a group of penitents, wading through a river carrying a giant cross, and warning the soldiers to go back the way they came. By the time they reach the village in the marshes, the group have been severely depleted, with one dead from the plague itself and another killed by bandits in the forests. Osmond's love, Averil, is missing and presumed dead, and the village, while initially welcoming, has more than its fair share of secrets. We discover that there may indeed be acts of necromancy practiced within its boundaries, and also that an earlier troop of soldiers, dispatched on the very same mission, have already been disposed of. But, and here is the interesting element from my perspective, this is a film that can be viewed in many ways. From the perspective of Ulrich and his men, the village is a source of evil, and as such their mission is just. But from the perspective of the village, they have been invaded by religious zealots, a group of armed soldiers who wish them nothing but harm. In this context, it is hardly surprising that they choose to drug, imprison, and eventually kill the soldiers. They are, after all, living peacefully and disease-free, and are essentially being invaded by a malignant army intent on religious persecution and conversion. The subsequent actions of the villagers are of course incredibly brutal, but in reality they are just defending themselves, and essentially doing to Ulrich's army exactly what they had planned to do to them, religious conversion and all. History, of course, is filled with righteous leaders inflicting their own belief systems onto others, from the Crusades to, very depressingly, the present day. The fact that Ulrich not only brings religion, but also the plague itself into the village, is for me the symbolic icing on the cake. The film was, by all accounts, very loyal to Poloni's original screenplay up to this point, but after they reach the village, the story changes significantly from the writer's original narrative. He had written the script as a commission from Ecos Films, a British studio best known for their movie Mrs. Brown, about Queen Victoria, which has starred Judi Dench. Poloni's original idea had been far more The Wicker Man than the final movie. It was a story about a policeman whose wife has just died, and who is sent to investigate a cult who claim to be able to bring back the dead. But this soon changed into a historical drama, based on Poloni's love of history, and also the realization that pre-Elizabethan settings are rarely used in film. However, his story still had a very supernatural climax, with the character of Ulrich revealed to be more than human, and the activities in the village far more paranormal than we see in the finished film. The screenplay was originally attached to director Jeffrey Sachs, and had become a German production when it failed to find UK financing. Sean Bean was also attached to the project, with actors Rupert Friend and Lena Headey also due to star. However, due to conflicting contractual obligations, Sachs had to withdraw from the project, and the producers began looking for a new director. According to Christopher Smith, quote, "Suddenly there was a finance movie available that the financiers would probably only greenlight if the replacement was among a list of directors they had in mind. I'd done a certain number of films, so obviously I was somewhere on that list. They called my agent to find out if I was available, and they sent me the script. I really loved it, so it was all very quick." End quote. Smith later said that on reading the first page and seeing that it was set in England at the time of the Black Death, he was pretty much sold on the spot. He was also very taken with the historical realism of its settings, and especially in the dialogue. Poloni has said that he decided immediately to not go for a Shakespearean type of dialogue, but instead to use a robust Anglo-Saxon that hopefully did not sound modern, but which was at the same time completely accessible. Smith was certainly impressed by this, later saying that he normally finds it impossible to watch many historical dramas due to the modernity of the dialogue and the cleanliness of the settings, both things that Poloni had deliberately steered away from. That being said though, by the time that Smith reached the midway mark, he felt that there were changes to be made. The second half of the script, he said, was far more literal and dealt with the head of the village, the devil, and by the end of the movie, the villagers were literally in a version of hell. Ultimately, he wanted to make a film that was much more grounded in reality, saying, quote, "The people of the time believed that the plague was sent by God to punish them for their sins, or by the devil to torment them. I wanted to find out what the characters felt, and posited them on a journey of is it real or is it not real? What would a necromancer be like if he existed? We added a fundamentalist knight, so it also touches on fundamentalism. It's a dark parable about how things haven't really moved on in the last 600 years." End quote. After speaking about his ideas with the producer, he and Poloni worked extensively together on a rewrite for the final section of the movie, creating a world where the supernatural might be possible, or, as it turns out, the whole thing might simply be a con. And this for me is possibly the film's masterstroke. Much like the religion practiced outside of the marshes, the supposed necromancy practiced within is no more than an illusion. It is an act of trickery designed for head of the village Lanjiva to hold onto power. People need miracles, she taunts Osmond as he hunts her through the marshes, and they worship the miracle makers, whoever they might be. The people in this village believed in me, and so did you. Much like the reasoning of the Red Death, in this world each man makes his own god, his own heaven, and his own hell. Lanjiva is played by Carice van Houten, who these days is probably best known for her role as Melisandre, the Red Woman, in the series Game of Thrones. As I mentioned earlier, the role of Lanjiva was originally due to be played by Lena Headey, and in a strange twist of fate, Van Houten originally auditioned for the role of Cersei Lannister, which just goes to prove that truth, or at the very least casting, is sometimes stranger than fiction. There are, of course, many parallels between Lanjiva and Melisandre, with their relationship to the occult and manipulative natures being the most apparent. Though, of course, the character in Game of Thrones had real magical powers, whereas here they are just a pretense used to maintain her power over the village. Van Houten's name had been suggested to Smith during the casting process, as German producer Jens Müller had already worked with her. This was on the 2006 Paul Verhoeven movie Black Book, for which she was nominated for multiple awards for her role as a young woman who becomes a spy for the resistance during World War II. Smith had been a great admirer of her performance in this, and co-producer Phil Robertson said that the moment she walked into casting, everyone knew she was right for the part. Smith later said that he wanted the leader of the village to be seductive and have an aura, and he felt that Van Houten had that. He also noted that she has two sides to her face, where she is very pretty, but also has a film noir, femme fatale aspect. Lanjiva dominates the second half of the movie when she is both on and off screen, which is no small achievement. But I have to say my favourite moment is a rather quiet one when, as Ulrich prays before dinner, she turns to fellow villager Hob, played by Tim McInerney, and says, "I was expecting grace, not the entire Lord's Prayer." Spiritually, the film draws on stories like The Crucible and The Witchfinder General, with the use of religion as an excuse to commit atrocities. Visually, however, the film draws on several other influences, including the films The Name of the Rose and Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Coincidentally, Smith also said that it was inspired by Bergman's movie The Seventh Seal, the film with which The Masque of the Red Death, despite Corman's delay to filming, was often also compared. Unlike many historical dramas, Smith wanted to go for a gritty and dirty realism. But this is not to say that the film is all dirt and grime. It certainly has more than its fair share of aesthetic moments. Early in the proceedings, there is a beautifully composed shot of Osmond praying in a shaft of light in the monastery, and this is focused entirely on the right-hand side of the screen, with the remainder an inky blackness. There is also the previously mentioned surreal shot of the penitents in the river, a stark white chalk pit where Osmond searches for Averil, which foreshadows the swirling mists of the marshes, and the necromancy scene, where Langeva pretends to raise his lover from the dead, surrounded by white-robed handmaidens. With Smith on board, Sean Bean remained attached to the project, something for which the director was incredibly happy, and to be honest, who can blame him? Bean, of course, has a remarkable star quality, adding a nobility to the role of Ulrich, who, unlike many of his men, is a man of faith and conviction. You might not agree with his belief system, and Lord knows I don't, but you can tell that he believes it, and more importantly, can see why his men are so loyal, though this is bar one, as it turns out. Bean's presence also served to up the game of the rest of the cast, arriving on set in character and demonstrating an incredible focus. When Bean was on set, Smith later said he was on his own, keeping away from everyone, and then did his thing in the scenes. But then at night, when he had a beer, he was a completely different person. In the lead role of Osmond, we have Eddie Redmayne, an actor who needs no introduction these days, given that he is a multi-award-winning performer with an Oscar, a BAFTA, a Golden Globe, 2 Olivier Awards, 2 SAG Awards, and a Tony under his belt, as well as far too many nominations to mention. Born in London in 1982, Redmayne made his screen debut in 1998 on British TV in an episode of a children's TV show called Animal Ark. He made his professional stage debut in 2002 in a production of Twelfth Night, and just 2 years later, he won the award for Outstanding Newcomer at the 2004 Evening Standard Theatre Awards. A year later, at the Critics' Circle, he also won an award for Best Newcomer. Although he made Black Death before his career went stratospheric, by the time of filming he had appeared numerous times on stage, television and film, including The Good Shepherd in 2006, Savage Grace in 2007, and The Other Berlin Girl in 2008. Despite this, though, he was not yet what one might call famous, which was a major factor in his winning the role of Osmond. Smith said that what he was looking for was a perfectly beautiful unknown, and not somebody with a public image that would conflict with the portrayal of an innocent monk. During production, Smith asked himself the question, how do we put a modern audience into the mindset of medieval fundamentalists and make them understand and justify our characters' savagery? And the answer, it would appear, is cast Eddie Redmayne. His performance here is quite incredible, travelling from a hopeful and somewhat naive character to a man who is completely broken by all that he sees and experiences. From the moments where he attempts to save a woman accused of witchcraft, to weeping in the aftermath of battle, and then being spiritually torn apart by the confrontation in the marshes, it is easy to understand how he ultimately transforms into the man we see in the film's final moments, a fanatic who kills in the name of God as a cover for a very personal revenge. The film was shot in Eastern Germany over a 7-week period and filmed in narrative order, something that was necessitated by Bean's availability, but which adds to the realism of the character dynamics. Shot in April 2009, in many cases it was a race against time to complete each location's filming before the flowers began to blossom, capturing a sense of desolation in the landscape that mirrors both the story and also the characters. By the time they reached the location of the village, which was built as a fully functioning village by the production team, the camaraderie, Smith said, and also the general exhaustion felt by the characters, was very real. The knights, or possibly mercenaries, are played by a stunning array of talent, including John Lynch, Johnny Harris, Eamon Elliott, and Andy Nyman. Nyman, who had already worked with Smith on the brutal 2006 horror satire Severance, has said that he would work with the director again tomorrow were he to be asked, highlighting the director's joy of the nasty. A man of enviable talent, Nyman has been nominated for several theatrical awards, including an Evening Standard Theatre Award and an Olivier Award in 2019 and 2020 respectively for the musical Fiddler on the Roof. And just this year, he has been nominated for another Olivier Award for his performance in the musical The Producers. He has also won awards for his writing work with the psychological illusionist Derren Brown, and has, of course, appeared in numerous films and TV shows. More importantly, though, for this series, he is very much a key player in the British horror scene. With Jeremy Dyson, he co-created the stage play Ghost Stories, which was then adapted into a 2017 movie, which he and Dyson both co-wrote and co-directed, and in which he plays the central role. As well as Severance and Black Death, he also starred in 2008's zombie horror satire Dead Set, the ABCs of Death 2 in 2014, and a sadly little-seen film called The Glass Man from 2011, which I hope to cover at some point, once I've worked out what to pair it with. As the torturer Dallywag, he is both menacing and suitably feral, biting out a man's throat during a battle scene and eyeing Osmond with no small amount of suspicion. He also has, aside from Sean Bean, the best death scene in the movie, marched to be crucified and disemboweled under the gaze of a body-mounted camera, all while maintaining an aggressive air of rebellion until the knife eventually rips him open. He has called the film reminiscent of 1970s movies, with its tale of a road trip leading to religious fervour, and he's also highlighted the power of the film's last few minutes, with a commentary on fanaticism that is rather unexpected in a film of this genre. Chris Smith comments on this ending in the movie's press book, saying, quote, "Osmond is a young monk who starts off an innocent boy with faith. His dilemma is whether he can love a woman and love God, and if the church says no, is that right? What was driving me with this film is the idea of taking this innocent boy and turning him into a fundamentalist killer. For this to happen, I needed to look at modern politics. The fundamentalist needs something to hate, so in this case, the person they hate is someone who hates them, Lanjiva. She hates Christianity and wants to eradicate it. So we've shifted the religions about a bit, but it's quite clear what we're doing." End quote. In the same press book, producer Jens Mura takes the analogy a step further. Quote, "Some of the characters in Black Death reminded me of Donald Rumsfeld, leading us all not to a medieval village, but into Iraq with a similar argument. We are on a journey of the righteous. We are battling the axis of evil. I think the extremism and fanaticism of people who are utterly convinced of the validity of their position hasn't changed, which is frightening in itself." End quote. On its release in 2010, the film garnered positive reviews. Variety said it was a savvy, stylish horror action movie that was more than the sum of its genre parts, while others compared it favourably to films like Witchfinder General and, of course, The Wicker Man. Sadly, it didn't really find its audience at the time, particularly when compared to the director's earlier films like Creep and Severance. Even today, it seems to fly under the radar, which is an incredible pity, as I think it has a lot to teach us, not just about the Black Death or medieval history, but also, unfortunately, about the world we live in today. The Masque of the Red Death and Black Death are, of course, both films about plague, and they are also both films about the manipulation of religious belief in order to acquire power. The morally corrupt Prince Prospero seeks to break Francesca and bring her across to Satanism, using his supposed pact with the devil as a protection from the plague and a means by which to exert control over his followers. Locked in his castle with a gaggle of subservient sycophants, he shows little regard for the well-being of his people and uses his power only to acquire more. Ultimately, he believes himself to be above any form of judgment, until he learns that even he will be held to account by a power far greater than he could possibly imagine. In Black Death, we see religion used as a pretense to impose violence and brutality on either side of the argument. The opposing groups each demonstrate intolerance, hatred, and a love of religious conversion, proving that whether one has religion or not, very often one side is no better than the other. And of course, it is a tale of extremism and fundamentalism that shows how young minds can easily be twisted into hatred if the circumstances are right. And although one is a dreamlike journey into the Freudian unconscious, and the other far more rooted in historical accuracy, grime, and dirt, together both films not only depict their own versions of the past, but also act as metaphors for our present. We can but hope that neither serves as a mirror for our future. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And also remember, you can always email the show at thehorrordouble@gmail.com and follow the Instagram account, thehorrordouble. Next week, we're going to be talking about two movies that very much flew under the radar at the time of their release, but have gone on to gain quite a following. The first of these is The Empty Man from 2020, starring James Badge Dale and Marin Ireland, and directed by David Pryor. Then we follow this with the debut feature from director Panos Cosmatos, Beyond the Black Rainbow from 2010, starring Michael Rogers and Eva Allen. This one in particular is quite a tough one to track down, but if you put Beyond the Black Rainbow 2010 into Google search, you should be able to find it somewhere. And to find out where you can watch The Empty Man in your region, you can visit justwatch.com, and if not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where it might be playing in other areas. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.